Scotland faces a massive decision on Thursday as to prepare for a pivotal upcoming Scottish election. We caught up with Chris McCall, Deputy Political Editor here at the Daily Record, to get the lowdown on all of the main political parties north of the border, starting with Sarwar and the Labour Party. So Chris, let's talk about Labour. So how are they pitching themselves going into the election?
Well, this is the kind of card that's been sent out to voters. Scotland needs change, and there we have Sarwar. On the other side there, we've got fix the mess, get the basics right, build a better future. That's the talking points that Sarwar, the Scottish Labour leader, that's what he wants to be talking about. Unfortunately for him and for Labour in Scotland, what a lot of voters want to talk about is how much they don't like Keir Starmer and how disappointed they are in the performance of the UK government, which obviously won a landslide election victory in 2024, including here in Scotland. You know, that's a important thing to remember is Labour have had, the 2010s were a pretty dismal decade for Labour. They had been supplanted by the SNP at Holyrood. They fell behind the Scottish Conservatives, the sort of mid-2010s. And, they were not looking great shape at all. And then 2024 came round and they won all these Labour MPs across Scotland. And there was a real feeling in certain quarters that it was now only a matter of time before Labour would go on to win at Holyrood. They haven't won a Holyrood election since 2003, which... I wasn't a working journalist at that point, but I do remember that election. It was a very long time ago. So this has been hanging over Labour. The fact that they've lost multiple Holyrood elections. And then 2024 came, this watershed moment where they finally were back at the races. And Sarwar, he'd always talked about the sort of like two-election strategy, win Westminster 2024 with a very strong Scottish result, use that as a foundation to build upon to go forward to 2026 to the Holyrood election. And obviously it's not panned out like that for various reasons, which I won't go into or repeat myself too much. The UK government has struggled. Some of that hasn't been their fault. They've had to deal with Donald Trump in the White House and his system of tariffs on the economy. They've had to deal more recently with the impact of the Iran war and that causing, certain increases in prices and all this sort of external stuff, but also the domestic stuff. They've not got it quite right, I think it's fair to say. And Scottish Labour has been punished as a result of that now. And Sarwar has been arguing, look, this election, the Holyrood election, Keir Starmer is not on the ballot paper. You're not voting for Keir Starmer. You're voting for me. You're voting for Scottish Labour. We're voting on who controls the Scottish Parliament and, the very extensive powers the Scottish Parliament has. And, that is a reasonable thing to say. It's not going to be Keir Starmer if it's in charge at Holyrood. However, it's not how basic politics works. Labour are a UK-wide party. And if one part of the Labour Party is not doing well in London, then it has an effect on the Labour Party in Edinburgh, it has an effect on the Labour Party in Cardiff. They can't just disassociate themselves entirely as much as maybe they would like to. Because obviously one of the big moments in Scottish politics this year was Sarwar very boldly, and this, we shouldn't underestimate just how much of a sort of big thing to do this was. And Sarwar stood up in Glasgow and said Keir Starmer should resign. So we had a Labour leader in Scotland calling for a Labour leader in London to go. And at the time, because no other big Labour figure in London, like we didn't see a Wes Streeting, we didn't see an Angela Rayner, we didn't see any of them come out to back Sarwar on this. So Sarwar was kind of stood alone. And he got a bit of flack from particularly political commentators in London who were basically saying, what on earth is he doing? Why is he calling for a Labour Prime Minister to quit? But, the answer is because Sarwar and Scottish Labour candidates, Scottish Labour activists, they've had to go out knocking on doors during this election campaign. And one of the first things voters will say to them is, what's going on in London? What's going on with Keir Starmer? And they needed something that they could respond with. They needed to be able to say, look, we recognise there's been difficulties. We recognise Keir Starmer's unpopular. For that reason, Anas Sarwar has stood up and said, we need change in London. We need a new Labour leader to come in. So I think that was the right call. However, the question is, have voters given Anas Sarwar any credit for this? And maybe to a limited extent, yes. But looking at the polls, and, a political journalist, we go on and on and on about polls, but they are a reality of these campaigns. The polls have not been particularly kind to Labour. And many of them, they have slipped to third behind Reform. In the worst case scenarios, they've slipped behind the Greens, and, even at the fourth place. I think that would maybe be the absolute worst case scenario for them. I think they still have a chance of finishing second. They are still at the races in some constituencies, but it's not been an easy campaign for them at all. They've struggled to talk about Scottish Labour policies as opposed to having to defend the UK Labour government. We've obviously seen the continuing fallout from the Peter Mandelson scandal, which has flared up again right in the middle of the Holyrood election campaign. And obviously that's something Anas Sarwar would rather not have had to talk about. It wasn't Anas Sarwar that appointed Peter Mandelson, the ambassador to the US, but it's still, a Labour government in crisis in London that Anas Sarwar's having to talk about when he's on the doorsteps in Glasgow and he's on the doorsteps in Edinburgh. And for those reasons, it's been a really, really challenging campaign for Labour. I mean, because they do have, here's their manifesto here. It's a pretty weighty document running to, 80-odd pages. A lot of quite detailed stuff about what they would do differently with public sector, what they would do differently with the NHS. But the question is, are Scots prepared to give them a hearing on this? And the polls suggest that not enough of them are for them to find a path to power. Labour have been trying to say in this campaign, like, we could, if certain preambulations happen, there's a pathway for us to take power as a minority government. Right now, a few days out from polling day, I think that looks unlikely, to put it mildly. They would need a lot of things to happen to fall into place for them. There would need to be a substantial drop in the SNP support on polling day. A lot of SNP voters not turning out. They would need, I think, Reform's support to be a bit of a mirage, and Reform voters not to turn out. And I don't think all of those things are necessarily going to happen. So they are in a difficult place, Labour. I think, Anas Sarwar, nobody could accuse him of not working hard. No one could accuse him of, ducking a campaign. And Anas Sarwar loves a campaign. He loves getting out activists. He loves speaking to voters. But he just cannot shake off the record of Keir Starmer and the UK government.
Do you think the Keir Starmer impact is ultimately going to cost Labour then, in terms of potentially finishing second in the election?
I think I think right now, I think Labour would bite your arm off to finish second. I think if they could finish second with roughly the same number of MSPs as they won in 2021, they would take that. I mean, they wouldn't admit this so publicly, but I think privately they would gladly take that. They could say we've held the line in the face of an extremely challenging set of circumstances, and they finished third in 2021, so second would actually be an improvement for them. But as I say, there's no guarantee they will finish second, and I think if the worst happens for them, come Friday when the votes will be counted, and by Saturday, Sunday next week, when the kind of fallout from the election, the backlash for certain parties happens, and Anas Sarwar, he probably will stand up and say, like, look, I told you that Keir Starmer was not the man for the job. I told you that Keir Starmer was going to cost us in the election. And I think, he'd be right to say that. I mean, obviously, whatever happens for Labour, presuming they don't win power, presuming, they do face a battle to kind of finish second or third, there will be questions asked of an Ask Sarwar as well. There'll be questions asked about, could you not offered a more exciting manifesto commitment? Could you not offered more robust criticism of the SNP? But for now, Scottish Labour do have the advantages of, they have a big war chest. They are quite a well-resourced party compared to others in Scotland. If you look at social media right now, if you're on YouTube or Facebook, there are Scottish Labour campaign ads everywhere. There is a lot of big spending there. Labour getting their message out on the digital sphere. They're also out knocking doors in the key constituencies. They think they're still at the races. So they would argue, like, look, we can upset the critics, we can upset the opposition parties, we can upset political journalists like me, and by proving them wrong and getting a better result. And the example they give is there was a by-election, a Holyrood by-election in Hamilton and Rutherglen last May, where Labour were not expected to do well at all. Everyone not everyone, but a lot of people assumed the SNP under John Swinney would pick up that seat relatively easily. It didn't happen. Labour won it. And Labour have been pointing to the example there. We've done it at that constituency. We can do that at a larger scale in 2026. And if they could do that, it would be a hell of a surprise. It would be a hell of a shock. But, Labour activists will tell you that that's what they're working towards.
I mean, at the moment, pretty much every poll has our support continuing to climb, or at least at record levels. Just as we're recording this, we've had another poll out that had us up a point with Survation to 12. Bearing in mind at the last election, we got 8%, and that was our best ever result. So even our worst polls at the moment are indicating we're on track for a record result. Our best polls have us in second place, ahead of Reform and Labour. I think what's behind a lot of that is not just that we have this vision that we're putting forward, things like universal free bus travel, fixing childcare, but the track record. People know that if they vote Green, we actually deliver this stuff. We delivered free bus travel for young folks. We scrapped peak rail fares. We scrapped school meal debt that a lot of families were struggling with, and we expanded free school meals. So it's that combination of, probably for the first time, the Greens being able to go into an election with quite a substantial track record of achievements, but also actually putting forward a vision for what we would do differently. It's quite surprising from other parties how some of them have really failed to put forward an alternative vision to what the current government are offering.
So let's talk about the Green Party, because they seem, from the outside, they almost seem like a little bit of a dark horse who could have a bit of a say in this election. So what are they talking about in the build up to this election, Chris?
Well, here's a Green manifesto, a very chunky effort. Let's demand better. That's the kind of Green message. Now, the Greens, they've got new co-leaders. So that's the kind of quirk of the Green Party, is they have not one but two leaders in Scotland. They have Ross Greer, who's been an MSP for quite a while, and they've got Gillian Mackay, and they took charge of the Scottish Greens last year. So they're very much, they would say that they're projecting an optimistic campaign pitched at voters who maybe have been left behind, particularly when it comes to issues like housing. I mentioned that housing is a big issue in Glasgow, but not just in Glasgow, in places like Edinburgh, places like Aberdeen, the big cities where the majority of jobs, particularly jobs for recent graduates, people that have come out of university in their 20s, they're looking to enter the marketplace, they're looking maybe to buy their first home. It's been a very, very difficult decade for people like that, unless they've got parental wealth behind them. Maybe, the aspiration of home ownership has been a kind of, challenge to them. The Greens say, look, we recognise that. We've got some bold policies that are going to tackle this. The Greens talk about things like rent controls, which we've seen to limited effect in Scotland in recent years. One thing that the Scottish Parliament has passed is they've given councils powers to introduce rent caps in areas that have got particular pressures. They haven't been used yet. That's an important thing, but the Greens want to use those powers. They want to push big intervention in the housing market. They want to build more social housing. And when it comes to taxation, They are the opposite of reform. You know, I mean, the Greens obviously would say we are the opposite of reform in every case. But whereas Reform have been arguing, you know, let's give people income tax cuts, including the wealthiest, the Greens are saying no, the wealthiest should be paying more because we need wealthy people, wealthy Scots to pay more to improve public services and to kind of pay for the big ticket items that the Greens are talking about in this election. One of the big Green policies that they've been really pushing is that they would make bus travel, so that's basically, you know, the average service bus that you get on at the end of your street to go into town, they want to make that free. And, you know, maybe a couple of years ago, people would raise their eyebrows at that and think, how on earth could you afford to do that? The Greens argue that in Scotland, if you are 60 or over, you already get a free bus pass. If you are 22 or 21 or younger, you already get a free bus pass as well. So that's a big Scottish policy that got introduced in recent years. The Greens pushed for it and the SNP got it through in government as young Scots. So if you are 16, 17, you're maybe left school and you're in your first job, you can take advantage of free bus travel. If you're a student, you know, going into college or university, you can take advantage of free bus travel. The Greens say we've already paid for it. You know, I think roughly, I think you're maybe looking at 40% of the population already get free bus travel. The Greens say, right, let's crack on and get everyone can get free bus travel. This is an aspiration, I think, that would take several years. You know, you couldn't just do it next week because the cost would be prohibitive. You would need to work with the private bus companies that put on existing services. But the Greens are absolutely committed to this. This isn't just a sort of thing that they are talking about and will quietly ditch. You know, the Greens are absolutely committed to this policy. And depending on the result on Thursday, depending on whether the SNP is the largest party at Holyrood, but they're short of a majority, the SNP have relied in the past on Green votes to get through budgets, get through big policies, to survive motions of no confidence in certain ministers. Often the Greens have been quite astute at getting some of their policies, you know, made into law. One of those was, as I mentioned, free bus travel for people under 22. I think if John Swinney was in a position and the SNP were in a position that they needed Green votes in the future, I think Ross Greer and Gillian Mackay would be pushing very, very heavily for this bus policy. I think it's something they really believe in. And also, as I mentioned, housing, which is a big, big issue that all the parties have talked about to varying degrees. The Greens would be looking for some big, big spending commitments, I think, in social housing. And whether there's the money for that, I mean, it all comes down to money, doesn't it? I think that remains to be seen. But the Greens they've fought a very confident, upbeat campaign. The Greens have never won a constituency at Holyrood before. They've always relied on the list vote in the past, but maybe I think that could change on Thursday. They're pushing very hard in the south side of Glasgow in the kind of constituency that was previously held by Nicola Sturgeon, and they're pushing very, very hard in central Edinburgh, which is currently held by Angus Robertson, an SNP veteran. The Greens are pouring what little money they have, because, you know, the Greens would tell you, you know, we don't get big corporate donors, we survive off our activists. They're pushing all their resources in these places. And I think they're definitely on course, I think, to probably record their highest number of MSPs. Whether that's enough to kind of make them challenging Labour, maybe it's enough to kind of like hold off the Lib Dems, remains to be seen. But I think the Greens are going into this week, this final week of the campaign, I think they're feeling pretty good about things.
Let's talk about Conservatives then. So obviously there's a lot going on in this election with SNP and Labour and Reform. So with the Conservatives, how are they pitching themselves, and how are they fancying their chances going into the election on Thursday?
Well, I mean, this has been an extremely difficult election for the Conservatives. They are facing a lot of things all at once. They're facing the lingering unpopularity of the previous Conservative government at Westminster, whether that was the government under Boris Johnson, the very brief Liz Truss government, or under Rishi Sunak. Frankly, a lot of Scots voters didn't like those UK governments. They didn't like the 30 years of Tory power, and they don't particularly like the Scottish Conservatives as a result. If that wasn't enough for them to deal with, they're also having to deal with this new centre-right party, Reform, who have hoovered up many traditional Conservative voters. They've hoovered up many traditional Scottish Conservative politicians. There's been umpteen Scottish Conservatives at council level have defected to Reform across the country, particularly in the northeast, up in Aberdeenshire, which is a sort of Scottish Conservative heartland. Even in Glasgow, they've lost like Thomas Kerr, one of the best known Reform figures. He was, until recently, a Scottish Conservatives councillor. Malcolm Offord, the Reform leader, he was a Scottish Conservatives peer. So Russell Findlay, who is the Scottish Conservatives leader, he's had his work cut out. Their campaign is coming down to kind of brass tacks, I would say, like the basic things the Scottish Conservatives like talking about, one of which is independence. They say, look, the SNP could win a majority. John Swinney's threatening another referendum. Vote Conservative. We are the party that's strong in the union. Whether that's cutting through, I don't know. The Scottish Conservatives have tried to paint Reform as weak on the union, because Reform are playing quite a clever game where, they wrap themselves in the Union Jack and, they're very pro-Britain. But at the same time, when they talk about a referendum and independence, they do use milder language. And I think that is because Reform thinks they can attract the disaffected SNP voters in a way that the Conservatives, they couldn't. So the Conservatives say, we are the party of the union. We are the anti-independence party, and only we can be trusted. If that's what motivates you, you should be voting Conservatives. They're also, the Tories traditionally, they're very pro-business. They, like Reform, are arguing that Scots pay too much tax. But I would say they've struggled to get their message heard. When it comes to centre-right arguments being made in this election, Reform have been making the running. The Scottish Conservatives would argue that it's us that's only offering detailed, comprehensive, ways of doing things. Reform are all vague and bluster, and how can you trust them? But I think they are struggling in this election. The Conservatives, they are going to lose MSPs. That's not questioned. It's the scale of the defeat that's facing them. And I think it could be significant.
To extend my gratitude to each and every one of you, all of the candidates, all of our MSPs who've been out there fighting for the union. I cannot tell you just how inspirational I find you. When I see you standing up there, fighting for the union, fighting for Scotland, you are the only opposition to the left-wing separatist stranglehold that has had this country. The Conservative Party is the only party that is serious about getting Scotland working again. And that is why it is so critical that everyone votes peach ballot for Conservatives. I know you've been saying this day in, day out, peach vote Tory, peach vote Tory. This has become our mantra, our chant, our slogan. But it is absolutely critical that we have Conservative representation in the Scottish Parliament. No one else is fighting for lower taxes. No one else is fighting to get people into work and off welfare. Welfare is drowning Scotland. The rider is getting heavier than the horse. Fewer and fewer people are having to work harder and harder. We need to make sure that our welfare system looks after those who are most vulnerable, but it cannot become a lifestyle choice. And it is vital that we make sure we use British energy. We've got a cheap power plant that's going to make life easier for so many people. We know the cost of living is really biting. Conservatives have a plan. We are the only serious party. You look at what the SNP have been doing in Scotland. All they care about referendum. And now we have reform paving the way so that the SNP can do that. We stand against that. We stand for the union. The Conservative Party is the Conservative and Unionist Party. Vote, and you will have people who are serious about making sure that lives can be better. The SNP and Labour have run Scotland, and all we have seen is the Scottish NHS and the education. We are fed up with that. We have had enough. No more. I want to see Russell Findlay standing there, First Minister of Scotland. He is much better than any of the other candidates. Better and braver. He stands up to the SNP nonsense day in and day out. Reform and the Greens think that this is just a game. The Lib Dems, I don't think they even know why they're there. But we know why we are here. We know that we have to fight for a better life for Scotland and its people every single day. We have to fight for a better life for everyone in the United Kingdom, and we need to keep our union together. So on May the 7th, I urge you, whether you're a Conservative or not, if you do care about the union, there's only one party.
Russell Findlay is a relatively new party leader. He wasn't in charge in 2021. You couldn't blame him for the scale of the Tory defeat at the UK election in 2024. You couldn't blame him for the rise of reform. These were all things that were happening before Russell Findlay took charge. But it's been an exceptionally difficult set of circumstances for them. The reform has been an absolute disaster for the Conservatives. And, whether it's Kemi Badenoch in London or Russell Findlay in Edinburgh, they're going to have to, I would hesitate to use the word accommodation, because there's a lot of Conservatives that don't want to accommodate reform in any way. But, they cannot go on the way they have, where reform just constantly steals might be the wrong word, but pinches election candidates from the Tories, pinches Conservative policies, because they're on a path to oblivion if they allow that to continue.